house was quiet when I woke up that morning. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that sits wrong in your chest, like you forgot something important but can't remember what. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom. The water stain in the corner that had been there since I was 9. The faded yellow paint my mother kept saying she'd redo. I'd looked at that ceiling more times than I could count, usually when I was trying to talk myself out of crying. That morning, though, I wasn't sad. I was getting married in 6 hours. I got up and walked to the hallway. My sister Vivian's door was shut. My parents' door was shut. I figured they were still sleeping, resting up before the ceremony. We'd all agreed the night before I'd head to the venue early to meet with the coordinator, and they'd follow by 10. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the backyard, the old oak tree, the plastic lawn chairs that had faded from green to a kind of colourless grey. I tried to feel something grand and cinematic. Instead, I just felt the familiar low hum of trying not to want too much. That's a feeling I'd gotten good at. I should back up. Because if I start at that morning, you'll think this is just a wedding story. It's not. It's the story of what happens when you spend 31 years believing that if you just work harder, stay quieter, take up less space, the people who are supposed to love you will eventually notice. Spoiler, they don't. My name is Elise. I'm the younger daughter in a family of 4, and for as long as I can remember, I was the wrong one. Not in a dramatic way. Nobody hit me. Nobody told me I was unloved. It was subtler than that, which almost makes it worse. Vivian was the one who got her school supplies bought first. Vivian was the one whose college applications my parents sat down and helped with. Vivian was the one whose friends were always welcome at dinner, whose failures were always explained away, whose choices were always quietly celebrated even when they didn't make sense. I was the one who learned to figure things out on my own. I put myself through nursing school, working doubles at a diner on weekends. I graduated with no debt, no help, and one text from my mother that said, "Congrats." Vivian got a graduation party with a catered lunch when she finished her associate's degree. 2 years later, on her 3rd attempt, I didn't say anything. I never said anything. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was the stronger one for it, that needing less was its own kind of power. I believed that for a long time. Then I met Owen. Owen came into my life the way genuinely good things usually do, quietly, without announcement. I was working a weekend shift at the hospital, 32 hours into a stretch that had already broken me down to my last 2 layers, when someone wheeled his mother in with a broken wrist from a fall. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without complaining. When I finally passed by and apologized for the wait, he looked up and said, "You look like you need the coffee more than I do," and handed me his. I told him I couldn't take a patient's family member's coffee. He said his mother would want him to. I took the coffee. We talked for 11 minutes while his mother was being discharged. He asked for my number. I gave it to him and then immediately assumed he wouldn't use it. He texted before he got to the parking garage. What I didn't know, what I chose not to make a big deal of, because it genuinely didn't matter to me by then, was that Owen's family was not like most families. His father had built a regional logistics company from a single truck in 1987. By the time I met Owen, the company operated across 14 states. Owen himself worked as the VP of operations, but you'd never know it. He drove a used Jeep. He wore the same 3 flannels in rotation. His idea of a fancy dinner was a steakhouse where they brought bread before you ordered. I fell in love with him before I ever saw his childhood home, and when I did see it, I made him promise we wouldn't make that a thing. He laughed and said okay. He meant it. I introduced him to my family around the 8-month mark. My mother was polite. My father shook his hand, and that was more or less the end of it. Vivian looked him up and down and said, "What do you do again?" When he explained, she shrugged and said, "I thought logistics was like trucking." Owen said, "Pretty much, yeah." Vivian lost interest. We got engaged 14 months later, at a state park we'd driven to on a random Sunday because neither of us had plans, and we both liked trees. He didn't have a ring yet. He asked anyway. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The ring came 2 weeks later. His mother, whose wrist I had indirectly helped stabilize, called me the morning he proposed and said, "Welcome to this family. We have needed someone like you for a long time." I stood in the break room at work and cried for 4 minutes, then splashed cold water on my face and went back to my shift. I told my mother that evening. She said, "Have you thought about the timing?" Vivian's been going through a hard time. Vivian's hard time, for context, was that her situationship of 6 months had ended. I said I understood, and I planned the wedding anyway. Here's the thing about planning a wedding when your family has always made you feel like an afterthought. You keep leaving space for them anyway. You invite them to the dress appointment, even though you know your mother will spend most of it talking about what would look better on Vivian's frame. You include them in the venue walkthrough even though your sister spends 20 minutes on her phone. You confirm the guest list 3 times. You give them the address. You book them a hotel 2 miles from the venue. And you keep thinking that this time, on this day, they'll show up the way you always needed them to. I believed that up until the morning I walked to the kitchen and noticed that Vivian's overnight bag was gone from the hallway. I knocked on her door. Nothing. I pushed it open. Empty. I walked to my parents' room. Also empty. I stood there for a second, confused, and then noticed the note on the kitchen counter, folded once, held down by the fruit bowl. My mother's handwriting. Elise. Vivian has been planning this trip to New York with her friends for months. It falls this weekend. We decided to go with her to help her through some things she's been dealing with. We didn't want to upset you the night before. We know you have Owen's family there and you'll be fine. The dress is beautiful. Have a happy wedding day. Mum, I read it twice. Then I set it back under the fruit bowl and finished my coffee. I don't know how to explain what happened in my body in that moment except to say that I had been quietly preparing for some version of this my whole life, and so the shock of it was somehow smaller than the resignation, like a test you always knew was coming and still aren't ready for. I had prepared for them not to show up fully. I had not prepared for them not to show up at all. I called Owen. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened. There was a pause, and then he said, "Okay, do you want me to come get you?" "I'll drive myself," I said. "Elise, I'm fine." "I know you are," he said. "That's not why I'm asking." I let him come get me. His mother, Gwen, was already at the venue when we arrived. She'd been there since 8, helping the coordinator arrange the centerpieces because she said she needed something to do with her hands, or she'd rearrange everyone's seating chart. When she saw my face, she put both hands on my cheeks and said, "What happened?" I told her, quietly, quickly, trying to make it sound like a logistical issue. She didn't let me make it small. She hugged me for a long time. She smelled like her house, cedar and something vanilla, and I stood there in the parking lot of the venue in my jeans and let myself be held for a minute. Then she pulled back and said, "My husband is walking you down that aisle. End of conversation." I started to argue. She said, "Elise, end of conversation." Owen's father, Ray, was a large, quiet man who wore his suit like it was slightly unfamiliar to him and spent most of the morning standing near the coffee station radiating calm. When Gwen told him, he walked over to me, patted my hand twice and said, "I'd be honored." That was it. No performance. Just a fact. I went and put on my dress. The ceremony was at a restored barn venue outside the city, exposed beams, string lights, an aisle lined with wildflowers. It held about 120 and it was full. Owen's family was large and warm and loud in the best way. My side was smaller, some co-workers, a few friends from school, but nobody noticed the imbalance except me, for about 4 seconds, and then the music started. Ray walked me down the aisle. He kept his pace steady and even, like he'd done this before, and halfway down he leaned slightly toward me and said, under his breath, "You doing okay?" I said yes. He said, "Good, because my son is going to fall apart when he sees you, and one of us needs to hold it together." He was right, Owen cried. Fully. Both of his brothers made fun of him during the reception, and he didn't care at all. I kept my phone in my clutch during the ceremony, mostly because I'd gotten used to carrying it everywhere from years of being on call. I didn't check it once during the vows. I checked it for the first time during cocktail hour, when I stepped inside for 5 minutes, and found 14 messages. 7 from my mother, 5 from Vivian, 2 from my father. The gist, across all of them, they had seen something. They had questions, they needed to talk to me. I'll explain the something. Owen's family had quietly sponsored a literacy charity event that happened to run alongside a local arts festival that weekend. A local news segment that aired that evening, the kind of soft human interest piece that gets shared around, covered the event and featured brief footage of the wedding reception visible through the venue's open barn doors because the reporter thought it was picturesque. Owen's family name was mentioned in the context of the charity sponsorship. The full segment, about 4 minutes long, was posted to the local news station's social media. My sister had apparently been scrolling when it came across her feed. I stared at my phone for a while. The messages were full of the kinds of things people say when they've realized the story they told themselves turned out to be wrong. We didn't realize. We thought you understood. Call us when you can. My sister's messages had a different texture, something between defensive and curious, trying to figure out the shape of what she'd missed without fully saying what she thought she'd missed. I put my phone back in my clutch. Owen found me a minute later. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. And I meant it. They saw the news segment. He watched my face. "What do you want to do?" That was the thing about Owen. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't tell me I had every right to be angry, or that I should cut them off, or that I needed to respond. He asked what I wanted. I thought about it for real. Not the version where I talked myself out of my feelings to make everyone comfortable. The actual answer. "I want to dance with your dad," I said, "and eat the food, and not think about them tonight." Owen said, "Done." We danced. We ate. His aunts taught me a line dance I already half knew from a bachelorette weekend 2 years prior. His brother gave a speech that made everyone laugh and then unexpectedly made half the room cry. Gwen found me near the end of the night and held my hand and didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. I didn't respond to the messages that night. Or the next day, which we spent at a hotel about 40 minutes out, just the two of us, ordering room service and watching old movies because that's what we'd agreed we wanted for a honeymoon pre-trip. I responded 4 days later, when we were back home and I'd had time to sit with it. I didn't write anything long. I didn't explain my feelings or list the grievances or make a case. I told my mother, my father, and my sister the same thing in slightly different words, that I loved them, that I wished things had been different, and that I needed some distance for a while to figure out what a healthy version of this relationship looked like, if one was possible. My sister called 3 times. I didn't answer. She texted asking if this was about the news segment, asking what Owen's family did exactly, asking whether I was mad about the trip. The questions had a shape to them that I recognized. She was trying to calculate something, trying to figure out what she'd lost access to. I noticed that none of the messages asked how the wedding was. None of them said congratulations. My mother sent a card about 2 weeks later. It said she was sorry. It said she hoped I was happy. It was the first time she'd ever said either of those things to me in writing, and I held it for a long time before putting it in the drawer where I keep things I don't know what to do with yet. My father called once, left a voicemail. He said, "I know we let you down. I don't have a good reason. I'm sorry." 6 sentences. The most honest thing he'd ever said to me. I listened to it 3 times. I'm not going to tell you I have this all figured out. I don't. There are still days when I pull into my parents' street on autopilot, forgetting that I'm giving myself space, and I have to remind myself that boundaries aren't punishments, they're just the shape of what's sustainable. What I can tell you is this. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in a hotel room with my husband asleep beside me, sunlight coming through the curtains, and for the first time I can remember, the quiet didn't feel like something wrong. It just felt like morning. Like a day with nowhere to be and nothing to brace for. I lay there and let it settle. Gwen calls every Sunday, not to check in on the drama, not to ask about my family situation, just to talk about her week, about what she's cooking, about a book she's reading, and whether I'd like it. Last month, she mailed me a cutting from her rosemary plant, because I mentioned once that I'd been trying to grow herbs on my windowsill. That's what it looks like when people decide you matter. Not the grand gesture, the rosemary cutting, the Sunday call, the steady presence. I know that now. It took me 31 years and a morning alone in my childhood kitchen reading a note under a fruit bowl. But I know it now, and I would not trade that knowing for anything my sister saw on her phone that night, scrolling through what she thought was just another weekend in someone else's unremarkable life. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that morning, not in a mystical way, just the plain, honest version of it. The idea that what we choose consistently over time tends to circle back around, not always on a timeline we control, not always in a form we recognize, but it comes back. My sister Vivian made a choice. She'd been making versions of that same choice my whole life, to see me as less, to factor me out of the equation when something more interesting came along, and my parents let her. That was their choice too. Nobody forced them to leave. Nobody took that note and put it under the fruit bowl. They did that, on their own, on the morning of my wedding, and then they got on a train to New York and assumed I would absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything else. What they didn't account for was that choices have outcomes, not punishments outcomes. There's a difference. A punishment implies someone is keeping score. An outcome is just what happens when you treat a person a certain way long enough, and the world eventually shows you what you built. They built a version of me who stopped waiting for them. I didn't do it out of bitterness. I did it out of exhaustion, and then out of self-respect, and then out of something that started to feel almost like clarity. You spend 31 years quietly accommodating people who never quite accommodate you back, and at some point the accommodation just stops feeling worth it. Not dramatically, gradually, like a tide going out. And here's the thing about developing that kind of resilience. It's not something anyone hands you. Nobody sat me down and said you're going to need to learn to hold yourself together when the people who should have shown up don't. I learned it by showing up for myself, again and again in small ways. Nursing school on my own apartment at 23, my own version of a life that didn't require their approval to feel real. That's not a story of someone who had it easy. That's a story of someone who decided that difficulty wasn't an excuse to stop moving. Owen didn't fix anything. I want to be clear about that. He didn't swoop in and make the wound disappear. What he did was show me consistently what it looks like when someone actually means it, when they say you matter. And then his mother Gwen showed me again. And his father Ray showed me on the walk down that aisle, in 6 quiet words, without any fanfare. That contrast between what I'd accepted as normal and what turned out to be possible was more instructive than any lecture anyone could have given me. I think about Vivian scrolling her phone that night and seeing us on the news. I think about the 7 messages from my mother. I think about my father's 6-sentence voicemail, the most honest thing he ever said to me. And I noticed that none of it arrived until there was something visible to react to. That's its own kind of information. The people who loved me showed up before they knew anything about Owen's family. They showed up with centerpieces and cedar-scented hugs and bread before the ceremony even started. That's the version of love I'm choosing to build my life around now. Not because I'm owed it, because I finally understand that I'm allowed to want it, and that wanting something real and holding out for it, even when it takes a long time, is not weakness. It's the most intelligent thing I ever did.